I sat in the pitch darkness of my car, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold my phone. Through the baby monitor app, my husband's voice cut through the static, cold and terrifyingly sharp. "She's finally gone," he whispered to someone standing in our living room. "The house, the money, the baby, it's all ours now. She has absolutely no idea." The man I had loved for 7 years had just handed me a death sentence for our marriage. My heart completely stopped. I was supposed to be driving to my mother's house after our massive fight, but instead, I was parked just down the street, paralyzed by the horrific truth. Follow my story until the very end to find out how a simple plastic baby monitor exposed a dangerous web of lies, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my voice has reached. My name is Elena Vance, and at 32 years old, I thought I had finally figured out the secret to a perfect life. As a freelance graphic designer, I spent my days turning chaotic ideas into beautiful, structured visuals. My personal life mirrored that perfect aesthetic. 7 years ago, I married Mark, a charming, fiercely intelligent financial consultant who always knew exactly what to say to make me feel safe. He was the kind of man who brought me coffee in bed, remembered every minor anniversary, and spoke about our future with an intensity that left no room for doubt. 6 months ago, our world became complete when our beautiful baby boy, Toby, was born. But perfection is often just a beautifully rendered illusion. The first crack in our picture-perfect life appeared just 3 weeks ago, wrapped in the guise of family obligation. Mark came home one evening and announced that his distant cousin, Clara, was going through a difficult divorce and needed a place to stay. He suggested she move into our detached guest house and, in return, she could help me manage the overwhelming daily routine of caring for a newborn. Clara arrived the next day, a strikingly attractive woman with intensely quiet eyes and a cold, polished demeanor. The very moment she crossed our threshold, the entire temperature of our home shifted. Mark's affectionate warmth toward me suddenly transformed into a detached, formal politeness. An unexplainable, heavy dread settled deep in my stomach, whispering that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few weeks, the cracks in my perfect life widened into a deep, unsettling abyss. It started with the small things, subtle shifts that most people would dismiss as the exhaustion of new parenthood. But my designer's eye, trained to notice the slightest irregularity, couldn't ignore the patterns. I began noticing that our mail was being intercepted. The monthly bank statements and investment portfolios that usually sat on the kitchen counter mysteriously vanished before I could see them. When I tried to log into our joint savings account to check on Toby's college fund, the screen flashed an error message. The password had been changed. When I asked Mark about it, he gave a dismissive, patronizing laugh, claiming it was just a routine security update and that I shouldn't stress my mind with financial details. But the most alarming changes happened when I walked through my own house. Multiple times, I caught Mark and Clara huddled together in the kitchen or the hallway, their heads close, speaking in urgent, hurried whispers. The exact second my footsteps approached, their conversation would instantly freeze, replaced by stiff, artificial smiles. Then, 2 days ago, I found the breaking point. While looking for a spare USB drive in Mark's home office, I discovered a hidden manila folder tucked beneath a stack of old magazines. Inside was a copy of my late grandfather's estate paperwork, the substantial personal inheritance meant solely for me. Attached to it were unauthorized transfer requests, bearing a signature that looked chillingly like my own, but I had never signed them. Staring at that forged signature, the fog in my mind instantly cleared, replaced by a cold, sharp survival instinct. I knew that if I confronted Mark directly, he would simply manipulate the narrative, delete the evidence, and spin it to make me look paranoid. I needed undeniable, absolute proof of their betrayal. So, I decided to orchestrate a performance of my own. That evening, I waited until I heard Clara's distinct footsteps coming up the porch, ensuring she was within earshot. I intentionally sparked a massive, highly emotional argument with Mark right in the living room. I shouted about Clara constantly overstepping her boundaries, his sudden emotional distance, and the missing financial transparency. Mark reacted exactly as I anticipated, coldly turning the blame on me and calling me emotionally unstable. Balling my fists to hide my trembling hands, I played the part of the defeated, broken wife perfectly. I yelled that I couldn't stay in this house for another minute. I ran upstairs, loudly packed an overnight suitcase, grabbed my car keys, and stormed back down the steps. I slammed the heavy front door behind me with maximum force, ensuring the echoing boom resonated through the entire house. I got into my SUV, started the engine, and aggressively drove down the driveway, making it appear as though I was fleeing to my mother's house in a fit of pure rage. But instead of leaving, I drove 3 houses down, parked in the deep shadows of an overgrown oak tree, and turned off the headlights. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the live audio app for Toby's nursery baby monitor on my phone. The static from the phone speaker hissed in the dark car, a low, mechanical buzz that amplified the frantic beating of my heart. For a long, agonizing minute, there was only silence. Then, the audio cracked. The distinct sound of footsteps echoed through Toby's nursery, followed by the heavy creak of the door opening. I held my breath, my fingers digging into the leather steering wheel as Mark's voice broke through the speaker. But it wasn't the voice of the husband I knew. It was cold, stripped entirely of his usual warmth, and dripping with arrogant satisfaction. "She's finally gone," he whispered loudly. "The door's slammed. She's halfway to her mother's by now." A second later, Clara's voice answered, her soft, synthetic laugh sending a violent shiver straight down my spine. "Are you sure she didn't suspect anything?" she asked, her tone entirely devoid of the timid, cousinly routine she had played for weeks. "Please," Mark scoffed, his chuckle mocking and dismissive. "Elena doesn't have the brains to piece this together. She genuinely thinks we're just having a marital rough patch. The house, the inheritance money, the baby. It's all ours now. She has absolutely no idea that every single asset transfer goes live the second the court declares her mentally unfit." I sat frozen, the blood draining completely from my face as the horrific scope of their long con operation laid itself bare. Clara wasn't his cousin. She was his long-term secret partner, brought into my home to help orchestrate my ruin. They had planned this from the very beginning, waiting for the perfect moment to strip me of my inheritance and take my child. The man I had loved for 7 years had just handed me a death sentence, completely unaware that his own digital trap was recording every single word. The natural impulse screaming inside my mind was to storm back into that house, confront them with the recording, and unleash my fury. But looking at the graphic design projects I manage daily, I knew that chaos never wins. Execution does. If I reacted with explosive anger, I would play directly into the narrative Mark was building, the image of an unstable, unpredictable wife. I needed to be a ghost. I forced my breathing to slow, locked the audio file on my phone, and drove to a hotel for the night. The next morning, I returned to the house, deliberately wearing a look of exhausted defeat. I apologized to Mark, telling him the stress of being a new mother was getting to me, and that I was deeply sorry for my outburst. I watched the triumphant, smug look pass between him and Clara. They thought they had broken me. For the next 4 days, I played the part of the fragile, compliant housewife to absolute perfection, completely disarming their suspicions. But behind the scenes, I was operating with lethal precision. Every night, while they slept, I duplicated the baby monitor audio files onto multiple encrypted cloud drives. I secretly contacted a high-profile forensic accountant and a ruthless family estate attorney, presenting them with the surveillance audio and the forged inheritance documents I had photographed. My attorney worked swiftly in the shadows, helping me legally move my late grandfather's entire inheritance into an unassailable private trust that required dual-factor verification they could never access. Mark thought he was executing a flawless long con, but he was completely blind to the fact that I had already shifted the entire board. I was no longer the victim. I was the trap. On the fifth afternoon, the trap was fully set. I arranged a formal meeting in our formal living room under the pretense of signing over asset management duties to Mark to ease my mental stress. Mark tried to conceal his absolute elation, quickly inviting their complicit notary and having Clara stand by as a witness. They sat across from me at the coffee table, a thick stack of fraudulent legal documents laid out before them. Mark handed me a pen, his eyes gleaming with the predatory satisfaction of a man who thought he had won everything. "Just sign here, Elena," he said, his voice dripping with that familiar, synthetic sympathy. "We'll handle all the heavy lifting from now on." I looked at the pen, then looked directly into his cold, calculating eyes, and smiled. Instead of signing, I reached into my pocket and pressed a single button on my phone. Instantly, the crystal-clear audio recording from the baby monitor began blasting through the living room's smart speakers. Mark's own arrogant voice filled the room. "The house, the inheritance money, the baby, it's all ours now. She has absolutely no idea." The absolute shock and instant color draining from Mark and Clara's faces was a masterpiece of pure terror. The notary gasped in horror as I calmly stood up, withdrew a fresh manila folder from my bag, and slammed it onto the table. I handed them full divorce papers, an emergency restraining order, and comprehensive fraud documentation simultaneously. 3 months later, the dust had finally settled, and the ruin Mark and Clara had planned for me became their own reality. Armed with the undeniable baby monitor recordings and forensic accounting proof, my attorneys secured an immediate victory. The court granted me absolute sole custody of Toby, ensuring Mark could never come near him again. Mark's public exposure destroyed his career as a financial consultant, and faced with multiple criminal counts of grand larceny and wire fraud, he was forced to file for bankruptcy just to afford his mounting legal defense. Clara fled the state the very week the trap snapped shut, desperate to evade her own impending arrest warrants. As for me, I sold the house that held so many ghosts and relocated to a breathtaking coastal cottage, starting a thriving independent design firm with the inheritance they tried so desperately to steal. Now, I'm deeply curious about all of you who have listened to my story until the very end. What would you have done if you heard your own spouse plotting against you on a plastic baby monitor? Would you have lost your temper and confronted them right then and there? Or would you have played the long, calculated game to guarantee your freedom just like I did? Comment the city you are watching from along with your thoughts below. Meanwhile, I am leaving on the final screen 2 other incredible stories from our channel favorites that will definitely surprise you. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next story.